In the last video, we set up a basic login system using Firebase Authentication and the Google provider so that we can log in with a Google account and we can log back out. One of the things that we didn't get to do in the last video that I want to do in this video is actually detecting the initial state of the user. So the Firebase library allows you to set persistence strategies so that when we log in, enough information is stored into local storage so that when we refresh the page, the user can be automatically re-authenticated and logged into our application. But we don't have that implemented here. So anytime I refresh the page or come back to our application, I have to sign in again, even though some of that is persisted. So we can see on the authentication state persistence page within the authentication docs, there's a description of how authentication persistence works. And there are a couple of different ways that you can configure it to either use local storage or session storage or have no authentication. And those will be, you'll pick the one that best matches what you want your security model or the needs of your application. You'll pick the one that meets the needs of your application. I believe by default here, it's using local in our web app. So to actually hook into that persistence, if we go back to our getting started page, we saw that there was the sign up, sign in method, and then there was this method that we can call on the auth provider, which we provide to that method a callback, and that callback is run anytime the authentication state changes. So in this case, when our user is detected, when a new user login or log out is detected, this function will rerun. So if we explicitly click a sign in button and the user gets signed in, this would run, but this also runs when Firebase loads the persisted version of the user account. So this would be how we could detect when we have a user that has been logged into our application and they're revisiting with that user information still in local storage. So to see that, we're going to run something like this inside of our Firebase module here. So we've got the auth object down at the bottom. So we can say auth.onAuthStateChanged. Console log, auth state has changed. And we can print out the user. Let's make sure that I typed in that right, on auth state changed. Good. Okay, so we are subscribing to the auth state here, and this will be called anytime it changes. So if we go back to our application and pop open our console window and refresh this, we can see the auth state has changed, and we have my info here because I signed in previously. And anytime I sign in and sign back out, we can see the auth state changing again. And now it's giving us back null. So the onAuthStateChanged knows whether the user has signed in. We can basically check this variable. If it's null, we're not signed in. If it's an object, we are signed in. So using that, we will be able to actually pull the user from persistent storage if we have that enabled in our Firebase application so that the user can just be automatically logged in when they revisit our application. It's worth looking at the API docs here. So I have the auth service pulled up in my sidebar. And then if I go to the onAuthStateChanged, we've got this function that takes a few parameters. And if it's hard to read here, you can check them out here. So the first parameter is this function that gets called with one parameter that's either a user or null. And that's what we saw in our code. there's also an error callback that we can pass in. So if there is a problem subscribing to the auth state changed, this will trigger this error callback. Unfortunately, this error callback is not, was there an error with auth in general? So like if the sign-in failed, that will not trigger this error callback. This error callback is just specific to the onAuthStateChanged. So we'll want to keep that in mind as we're updating our hook to use this. And also importantly, we can see this returns an unsubscribe method. So it gives us back a function that if we call, will stop this callback from running. So that'll also be important for us when we start moving this into a hook. Okay, so let's get into it. We've got an idea of how this works from reading the docs. What we want to do is pull up our use user. This was our custom hook that we wrote to let our components use the authentication service without having to know the internal details of the authentication service. And we can, let's clean up a few things here. We have a couple of console logs that we don't need. Don't need any of those. And now we can start working on that onAuthStateChanged addition here. So we don't want to just do auth.onAuthStateChanged here, because if we do this, every time useUser re-renders, we get a new listener that is attaching to the onAuthStateChanged event. What we want to do is only do this when the useUser hook is mounted. And that's where our useEffect comes in. So I'm going to make sure that that gets imported, and then I'm going to wrap this in our useEffect, and make sure you've got useEffect importing up here. And let's create unsubscribe and return unsubscribe. So we haven't done this. I don't believe we've done this at this point, but the useEffect, you can return a function that will be run to clean up the effects. And that's what we want to make sure we're connecting here. Our onAuthStateChanged gives us the function that stops this callback from running. And we just want to make sure that useEffect, we're returning that from our effect so that React can clean up when this effect needs to be cleaned up, like when our hook is unmounted from the page. And I am going to make sure that this only runs when the hook is mounted, and the unsubscribe is run when this is unmounted. Let's add a comment here. Return a function from your effect to register some function to run when the effect is cleaned up. Okay, so we've got our onAuthStateChanged here. What we want to do, if we flip back here to the docs, is also handle this error that could potentially be triggered, which is our second parameter to onAuthStateChanged. So what we might want to do is say like onChanged or onChange. That will be a function here, and onError will be an arrow function here. And instead of creating the arrow function inline, we can say onChange and onError, which will register both of those. So this will always give us the current user, and this will always give us the error if there is one. So if there's an error, I want to make sure to get that into our console logs so that we can debug it using the by pulling up the console tools to understand what error was actually thrown. And then let's also here we want to set the user state. So if something went wrong, let's just null out the user, say we are no longer loading, and we will throw that error into the state so that we could potentially use it later for displaying some kind of error message to the user. And let's make a note. This is called only when not when sign in or sign out error. And then let's work on our onChange. So onChange is called when Firebase loads up the user from persistent storage, or when the user, the auth changes. So here we can set the user state to be the user is our current user, so whatever is passed into this change handler. We can stop loading, and our error is null here. Can't type today. Okay, so with that in place, we should have something. Let's make sure we got no compile errors. We should have something in our browser that can detect the auth state and drop it into our use user hook. So we've got this sign in. Let's make sure that I'm signed in and refresh the page here. And you can see that it's immediately, well, not immediately, after some number of milliseconds here, it is registering that the user is actually logged in and flipping me over to the logged in version of this page. But if I'm logged out and I try and do that, it's not actually kicking me over to the signed in page because I've explicitly logged out. So you're in control of that persistence. Remember, if you are running into problems, make sure that you're configuring your persistence. It defaults to local for me. If that changes in the future, you may have to explicitly configure this as you're following along. Or if you want to turn off this feature, you can change the persistence to none or change it to session to make it a more restrictive version. So you're in control of that. I want to keep this on as local because I like that users don't have to explicitly log in, re-log in when they have just refreshed the page. Let's flip back to our code here. There are, I think, a couple things that I want to change. So with this hook, our user always starts off as null and isLoading always starts off as false. But our user could start on another page within our application and then flip over to the home page. And I would like for our hook to start in the right state based on whether the user is logged in at the moment that that hook is mounted. So I don't want us to have to go through the use effect to get the initial state of the user. And that's actually something that we can grab directly from the auth service, the auth current user. This will tell you what the auth currently has as the current user. It'll be null if there's no user, and it'll be your user object if there is a user there. So keep in mind that this is not immediately filled in with the persistent information. So we still need all this logic here with the onAuthStateChanged. But if Firebase has had enough time to set up the persistence or to read from the persistence the user and re-authenticate them, this will be filled in. And then I want to start this off in our loading state. if we have no user. Unfortunately, the Firebase API does not give us an easy way to tell if the auth has been initialized yet, which would be what we would really want to use here. So this is our stand-in. We're saying if there's no user, let's just start in the loading state. If there is a user, we don't have to start in the loading state. And what happens is that when you call onAuthStateChanged, this will run at least once. So it will run when you register a handler, or it will run when we get the user from persistent storage. So at some point, if we start in loading, this will flip to false from registering this handler. So it's fine for us to start in a loading state. So give that a save, make sure this still runs. So we're logged in here, sign out, sign in. Refresh the page, and it's all working. Let's see if there's anything else we need to change here. I think we're good with the onAuthStateChanged. Now that we have this hook that subscribes to whether or not the user is logged in from persistent storage, what I want to do is actually have our application wait for this to be resolved before it even displays to the screen. So because we made our useUser hook, we can do this in multiple places. We're doing it on the homepage, where the homepage needs access to be able to sign in and out and observe the current state, like whether there's an error, whether it's loading. But we can also use the user here on our app. So here we could use user. Whoops, not trying to destructure this. User state equals use user. And now our app knows whether or not the user is loading or whether there's been an error connecting our user, connecting our onAuthStateChanged handler. So I want to do something really simple, like let's put a loading spinner on the page here. And we want this loading spinner to be our page contents while we're doing that really quick initial check to see if the user is logged in. And once the user is logged in, then we can put our actual content on the page. So we have is loading from our user state. So we could do something like this. User state dot is loading question mark. If we are loading, then we can throw our loading spinner here in the parentheses. Otherwise, we can throw the rest of our contents on the page. And I want to make sure, let's see, use browser router. Oh, my comment is breaking things here. Oh, you know what? It's complaining at me because all of this needs to be wrapped in one element, and I have 3 elements side by side. So I think actually for what we're doing here, I'm going to undo this. I'm going to move my page header outside of this conditional so that we always have the nav bar. And let's move the page footer down here outside of this so that we always have the footer. And then my switch here, let's get rid of the starting comment, which is breaking things. So now we have one single element in here. So our routes are only going to load after this user state is no longer loading. So we had a spinner for a second while we're detecting whether or not we're logged in, and then we get kicked over to the actual login page, not the, we're not getting kicked over to the logged out page because we have in our local storage our user account info. So if I log out and then refresh the page, we go directly into the logged out version of our page. But if I'm logged in, we should see what we just saw a second ago, where I get kicked over directly to the logged in version of the page. So the advantage of what we have just done is that in any of our routes, if we want to have access to the user, we know that the user state has resolved by the time we've gotten to one of these routes. So if for some reason on the quiz page we needed to have the user logged in and have access to the user, we now know that the user has initially been resolved. So if it was stored in persistent storage, it's been filled back in and registered with our application so that we could use it in this route. And we'll see in the future how to create protected routes so that the user can only access that if we have a currently logged in user. So I think this is all I want to do in this video here. One thing that I will note is that because we have added in this onAuthStateChanged, it's really, this is loading is really telling us two things. It's telling us whether or not the user is being initialized, or we're still in the initialization state of waiting for Firebase to check the persistent information and fill that in to our onAuthStateChanged. And it is telling us when the user actually goes through the explicit login and log out flow. And if I were to refactor this, I would probably want to separate out that information so that our application isn't responding to the sign in, sign out loading state. It's only responding to the initialization state. Because I'd rather be able to handle the loading state in the home page and the initialization state at the application level. But this is good enough for our purposes. If you're interested, I would recommend trying to refactor your use user so those are separated out. And one way you can do that is instead of having an is loading Boolean, you could have a status field here that says like initializing, or it says loading or resolved. You know, you can set that to whatever you want and then handle that in your components. Okay, so that's where I'm going to wrap this up. We have our use user updated so that it pulls the information from persistent storage if we have that enabled with our application, and then that allowed us to be able to actually only show our application routes after the loading has resolved. In the next video, I'll show you one more polished tweak that we can add here to make sure that when we use this user across multiple components, we aren't actually registering another set of state and another handler. We can make sure that there's only ever one set of state and our auth state changed handler.